When we think about why someone would commit murder, our minds usually go to these really complex places, right? Like deep-seated jealousy or intricate revenge plots. We kind of expect the reason to be as big as the crime itself. But what happens when it's not? In this explainer, we're diving into 3 cases where the motive for murder was just shockingly simple. Let's get into it.
This quote, it just perfectly captures the completely broken logic we're about to explore. It was actually said by someone connected to one of these cases, and it really gets to the heart of the whole thing. These crimes weren't just brutal, they were fundamentally senseless.
So, that's what we're going to dig into today. We're going to break down 3 totally different cases with 3 totally different women who are all driven by the most basic, brutal desires you can think of. We're going to see how for them, murder wasn't this huge, unthinkable act. Nope, it was just another tool to get what they wanted.
All right, for our first case, we're heading to Lexington, Kentucky. And this story is an absolute whirlwind. It all spirals completely out of control in a single night of just pure chaos, fueled by addiction and a desperate, violent need for cash.
So let's meet our first pair, Tina Powell and Lefonda Faye Foster. Now Foster, she was the leader. She had this formidable reputation, known for being mean. And Powell, she was her accomplice. Together, they had a reputation for doing pretty much whatever it took to get money for drinks and drugs.
And you can see from this timeline just how fast everything went off the rails. It all started with them just trying to cash a small check with some elderly folks they knew. But that spiraled into a hostage situation, and as the night went on, that desperation just boiled over into rage, and that rage turned into a murder spree that spread across the entire city.
And this is the number that kicked it all off, $50. That's it. The value of one single Social Security check they couldn't get cashed. That tiny bit of frustration was the trigger for one of the worst mass murders in the history of Lexington. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
But here's where it gets even more twisted. The reason for the first murder? It wasn't even about the money anymore. According to the source, the reason was, there wasn't one, other than this chilling quote right here. The first victim was killed simply because they wanted to see what it was like.
And once they crossed that line, there was no turning back, right? With one person dead, everybody else was now a witness. So they made a decision: eliminate everyone. 5 people were murdered, one by one, all across the city.
And the way their rampage ended, just as senseless as how it started. They drove themselves to a public hospital, literally drenched in their victims' blood, to try and clean up. Of course, the hospital staff took one look at them and immediately called the police. It was a shockingly clumsy end to a night of absolute horror.
Okay, let's move on to our second case. We're shifting gears now, from that chaotic, drug-fueled violence to something much colder, way more calculated. This is a story where, believe it or not, the killer saw murder as the holier choice.
This right here, it just perfectly lays out the absolutely twisted logic at the heart of this case. For Melinda Harmon, who was a preacher's daughter, divorce was a huge sin in her evangelical community. It would have meant social ruin. But murder? Murder would make her a widow, a figure of sympathy. In her mind, that was the more acceptable path.
So a plan starts to form in her head. See, she had become obsessed with this young, successful student named Mark Mangelsdorf. She managed to convince him that since divorce was off the table, her husband David had to die so they could be together. The two of them then plotted a murder that they would disguise as a home invasion by 2 attackers who didn't even exist.
And her reasoning, plain and simple, is captured perfectly in this quote. Her social standing was worth more than her husband's life. Being the tragic widow was so much better than being the shunned divorcee. It's just an incredibly chilling way to look at the world.
But here's the part that's truly unnerving. They got away with it for 2 decades. The case went completely cold. Melinda and Mark both went on to live successful lives. They got married to other people, raised families. It wasn't until a prosecutor decided to reopen the case 20 years later that their secret finally unraveled, and Melinda ended up turning on Mark to try and save herself.
For our final case, we're diving into the criminal underworld of Melbourne, Australia, and the motive here is pure entitlement. It's the story of a self-proclaimed gangster queen who genuinely believed murder was a totally reasonable response to being insulted.
So meet Judy Moran. In her own mind, she was criminal royalty. Her husband and both of her sons were major players in the Melbourne drug scene,
And after they were all killed in gang wars, she believed she was entitled to a hidden fortune worth millions. But the reality? Her brother-in-law offered her a $4,000 monthly allowance. To Judy, this was an insult she just could not bear. And look, crime was nothing new to her. It was practically in her blood. Her dad was a thief, she became a champion shoplifter, and then she married right into the top of the Melbourne drug world. Violence and crime, these weren't abstract ideas to her. This was the family business.
$4,000. That's it. That's the number that sealed her brother-in-law's fate. She was so deeply offended by this amount, so positive he was hiding millions from her, that she decided he just had to die.
The plot itself was almost like a dark comedy of errors. The first hit was a spectacular failure when the gunman's weapon jammed. The second try, though, that one worked. But in the end, it was her own arrogance that did her in. The police found a neatly packaged bundle of evidence in her home, including the gunman's disguise. I mean, it was about as open and shut as a case can get.
Okay, so let's pull back for a second. We've got three completely different women from three completely different worlds. A drug addict, a preacher's daughter, and a gangster matriarch. So how do we tie all this together?
I mean, what's the thread that connects these people who seem so different on the surface? What is it that allowed all of them to look at another human being and see them as just a disposable obstacle in their way?
Well, what the source material points to is a single, chilling diagnosis: sociopathy, a total and complete lack of empathy for other people, an inability to feel any remorse for what they've done. This is the psychological state that lets a person devalue a human life to the point that it's worth less than $50, less than their social standing, or less than a bigger monthly allowance.
And that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? For Foster, Harmon, and Moran, murder wasn't some huge, passionate, emotional act. It was a transaction. It was a simple, practical, and in their minds, a perfectly acceptable tool to solve a problem and get them closer to their goal. And so this brings us to the final question I want to leave you with. When someone sees another human being as nothing more than a roadblock in a simple transaction, is that something created by their world? You know, by addiction, by religious extremism, by a life of crime? Or is it something they were just born with? That's definitely something to think about.